Thank you. And just before we start, can I just say thank you? Some of you have sort of heard through the Christian grapevine, which isn't always a bad thing, you know. Some of you have heard that really I haven't been well for the past sort of 6 or 8 weeks. I was just feeling rough at the beginning of March and sort of did that thing, oh, just keep going. And in the end, I went to the doctors and said, look, I just don't feel right. And she did a few tests, including an ECG, at which point her face went very pale and she said, you're not leaving here. And I was like, oh, okay. So she got the ambulance, took me straight to West Suffolk. And basically I was in West Suffolk for about 9 or 10 days. And if you know me, I'm not a very good patient. And they sort of discovered that the top 2 chambers of my heart aren't pumping blood properly. They're only pumping about 15%. And when you've got a body as big as this, it needs a bit more than that. So they put me on lots of medication and tried to work some stuff out. And obviously that's sustaining it. So actually I feel a lot better now than I did then. But they haven't solved the problem. So on the 16th of May, they're going to take me in for a little procedure, which they call the Great Reset. It's like turning your computer on and off again to solve the problem. They're just going to stop my heart, and then they're going to do their and hope that it starts. Well, not hope that it starts again. It will start again, but hope that it starts again in its correct rhythm. It's just not doing what it's meant to do at the moment. So please, if you remember, pray for me. But thank you. I've had lots of sort of messages from people on Facebook, not just from this church, but from lots of churches. And that's when the church family really comes into its own. So thank you. But I also realise that that's minor compared to what some of you are facing right now. And that connects a little bit into the series that you started last week. If you weren't here, Chris started the series that you as a church are going to be looking at, which is driving through fog. And I guess most of us, if not all of us, have had that experience where fog descends on a road and we're driving and you almost don't know what to do. And Chris described in his talk last week about being in Derbyshire back when he first learned to drive, and a really heavy fog came down, and so thick and heavy that you couldn't even read the road signs, you were saying. And I remember a time, it wasn't when I was driving, but I do remember a time down in Cornwall, which is one of my favourite places to be. And I was in the sea with my sister. It's a real special time. We both like getting in the sea together, sometimes to surf, sometimes to boogie board, and sometimes just to do what we call wave jumping and go in and try and jump waves. And I remember being in the sea and sort of seeing the sea fog rolling in, but it was fine. We were only up to our waist, not a problem. But then suddenly, out of nowhere, the fog was there. And so I said to Izzy, my sister, well, we better go back to the car. Mum was up in the car park. And we turned round and suddenly realised we had absolutely no idea where the car park was, or where the beach was, or even how to get out of the sea. Now, I know that sounds ridiculous, because in your head you think, well, you were facing that way, just turn round that way and walk in. But it's not quite as easy as that. And so I was the big brother. I was about 21, so my little sister was sort of 14 or so. And I was like, okay. And we started walking in, and I realised very quickly that we were nowhere near where I wanted us to be, or where the car park was, or anything. And actually, you know, eventually, I think a bit more by luck than judgment, if I'm honest, although I pretended to her that I knew exactly where I was going. We sort of ended up by some rocks, which I recognised, and then meant I could get. And we ended up on the road, which was sort of a quarter of a mile walk down the road to get back to the car park. Just as we got to that point, I heard the car horn beeping. And you know what? That confirmed that I was going in the right direction. But actually sometimes when we're in a foggy situation, it's best to stop and to listen rather than try and see. Apparently, lots of cars in the car park had realised the problem, not just for us, but for several people on the beach, and had all turned their lights on, thinking that we'd see the lights, but didn't. And it was only when somebody started beeping their horns that others started beeping their horns. And it's true in life, particularly when we're trying to follow God. Sometimes it's good just to stop and to listen rather than fight our way through. And we've all been in those situations in life, those fog situations. Maybe it's a relationship breakdown and we don't know which way to turn. A health concern strikes you, or there's job insecurity or redundancy. And it feels like the fog of life has descended and we don't know which way to turn. People even say just take one step at a time, don't they? But even that's difficult to do when you don't know which direction to take the one step in. You know, even the faith of taking one step can feel like a big risk. So what I'm going to be talking about this morning is sort of a sideways step into the series that Chris is on. He's going to continue the series next week. But we're going to look at a character in the Bible who sort of sat in these fog descending moments. It's a character we'll probably know quite well, but maybe haven't thought of it in this way. And it's the character of Joseph. And now, of course, when we start the Joseph story, most of us sort of start actually in the middle, which I've probably got up here, I think. You know, this story of Joseph's dreams in chapter 37 of Genesis. That's where we tend to think. That's how we tend to start. But of course, his story actually starts further back. You know, Joseph came from a fairly dysfunctional family. Some of you may be thinking the fog of your life comes from your family. Well, Joseph came from a pretty dysfunctional family. His mum, Rachel, was desperate for children, and that wasn't happening for her. So she kind of forced God's hand. And don't put your hands up at this point, but how many of us have tried to force God's hand? Because it's not happening as quickly as we want it to, or in the right way that we want it to. So we go, oh, well, okay, God, I sort of know better. Which is what Rachel did. She tried to force God's hand, and so she encouraged Jacob, her husband, and to sleep with a slave girl, and in fact other people. And this whole family became sort of this mess of jealousy and envy and manipulation and lack of patience, even before Joseph was born. But finally, Rachel became pregnant and Joseph was born. So instantly, he became mum and dad's favourite. It's no wonder the other brothers had difficulty with him. And again, I just want to pause here and connect it into our lives. It's easy to blame some of our issues and our problems on our past. And of course, our past has an impact. You know, if you're driving your car, some of the things you have or haven't done to maintain the car might, you know, mean when you do face fog, it gets difficult. You know, if you've got dirty, inoperable headlights, you know, it makes it harder to see. But there's also a time where we sort of have to stand up and take hold of a situation ourselves. To stop blaming others, to stop blaming the past, to stop blaming life's course, and to deal with it. We've probably all been in those situations in the car, haven't we? Where we turn to the person sitting next to us, our husband or our wife or our partner or whoever. Well, it's your fault. It's your fault we're lost. Why didn't you do X, Y, and Z? I'm not saying that your wife would ever say that to you, but it's your fault. Why didn't you do X, Y, or Z? You know, Why didn't you stop and ask for directions earlier? Why didn't you read? And of course, we can then go back, well, why didn't you read the map properly? Didn't you know that the blue lines aren't the motorway, they're the river? And I remember that clearly because that happened in my car once. You know, it's easy for us to look back and to blame others. But that doesn't help us solve the problem. And whilst we recognise our past, sometimes we need to stand up and say, okay, I need, with God's help, to get out of where I am now. And Joseph was sort of in that position. He was 17 when the story really gets going. And we know that Joseph had this special treatment from his parents. He'd got this coat of many colours. Some people think that it even translates better as coat with long sleeves. Whichever one it was a coat of you're special. It was a coat of you don't need to do the hard manual labour. It was a coat of you get to sit back and watch others sort of make your life easier. It was an expensive robe. It marked him out as special. Perhaps he should have been tending the flocks with his brothers, but he didn't really want to do that. His brothers hated him, and Joseph isn't wild about them either. Now, it could be that we read this, that Joseph is sort of arrogant and cocky and a bit of a snitch because he runs back to his parents. It might be that he's just acting like any other teenager does. But whatever it is, we read that Joseph goes back to his parents and gives them a bad report. And then, to make matters worse, he shares a dream, doesn't he? One of the classic first dreams. He shares a dream of how his brothers will bow down to him. Probably not the wisest thing to share. Can you imagine if you've got brothers and sisters? Can you imagine sharing, oh, I've had a dream. And one day you're going to bow down to me. I know what would have happened in my family if I'd shared that to my older brother. I hope this isn't too gross for church, but my brother would have pushed me to the ground, knelt on my arms, and put that dribble of spit towards my face. Did anyone else's brother do that? No. Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah. You know, he's like, right, I'm not bowing down to you now, am I? You know, and that was sort of Joseph. It wasn't wise for him to do that. But when we hear that story, particularly if we're in fog, perhaps the natural question is, well, I wish it was that clear for me. I wish I had a dream about where God wanted me to be and what God wanted me to do and da-da-da. I wish God told me about my plan for my life. I wish he gave me dreams like he did for Joseph. Wouldn't that make life so much easier for us? When the fog of life descends, all we want is clear direction. And in the story of Joseph, we often concentrate on the dreams. That's what Joseph was known for. But actually, the dreams make up a very, very small part of the story. He had sort of the one or two dreams at the beginning when he was 17. And then we hear nothing else about dreams until he's about 40 and he's in prison and there's the cup bearer and the baker. And they had dreams that couldn't interpret. And then the Pharaoh had the dream. So the bulk of Joseph's life, he didn't have any more dreams. It wasn't like he woke up every night with another message from God through dreams. No. Most of his life, he sat just remembering this one dream he had as a teenager. You know, a couple of decades on, really, he's called to interpret his fellow prisoners' dreams. And then 2 or 3 more years on, he's called to interpret Pharaoh's dreams. This wasn't a regular occurrence for him. Don't think that Joseph grew up with God speaking to him every day. He didn't have this sort of audible voice from God every morning. This is what I want you to do today, Joseph. No, he had 2 bits of fairly unclear direction in 10 years. And yes, he saw his brothers bowing down to him, but he didn't know why. He didn't know when. He didn't know how it would happen. He didn't know where it would happen. He didn't know what it would involve. It's not that clear at all. Most of the time, God's leading is often not very clear. God doesn't lead by audible step-by-step instructions. In fact, God does that very, very rarely. Of course he can, and I'm not denying that he does on occasion. I mean, he spoke creation into being. We believe in a speaking God. But he often doesn't do that in our lives. He's revealed himself through his word, and specifically through the person and work of Jesus Christ. And he says, if you want to know direction, if you want to know the course of your life, if you want to know the way to live, if you want to know what decision to make, if you feel the fog of life has descended, look at the person of Jesus and read my word. Now, I know that doesn't make it always very clear. I mean, the phrase, what would Jesus do, is a very powerful phrase. But then I look at the disciples who spent 3 years with Jesus, and sometimes they were very surprised by what Jesus did. So the phrase, what would Jesus do, is helpful for us, but it's not always easy to discern. But the question is our decision-making process in the fog of life orientated on Jesus? Is it orientated on and through his word? When life is foggy, when we've got choices and decisions to make, do we do this or do this? Are we holding Jesus and his word as prime authorities in our decision-making process? Because that's the walk of a Christian. If you're sitting here this morning wondering what a Christian is, it's somebody who holds Jesus and his word as the prime authority in our lives. The world has different morals at times. The world has a different decision-making process. But Christianity, at least defined by Jesus, Christianity is the narrow way, he calls it. And he asks us to follow him. Now, don't fall into the trap of thinking the narrow way is a restrictive way. We often think broad gives us loads of choice and narrow is restrictive. But I don't think so. I think that's kind of a false theology, really. You know, to think that God just has one plan for us, an A plan. That sounds great. But what happens when we mess up? If I'm honest, I'm probably on God's Z-100 plan. Because I look at the choices I've made in life and realise that often they're perhaps not what God would have wanted of me. And if God has an A plan, that means somehow I've let him down. And to get really deep for a moment on a Sunday morning, is Matt Levett really powerful enough to thwart God's plans? I don't think so. I'm not powerful enough to mess up what God wants for me and his plan for my life. In fact, the sort of description I like to give it is, I think biblically, God's guidance for us is much more like an open field with boundary fences rather than a tightrope that I have to somehow stay on. The narrow way still allows for free will and for choice, but gives us guidance for making the best. If I decide to step beyond his boundary fences, trouble may ensue. And Joseph had this dream of sheaves of corn bowing down to him. and another with sun and moon and stars bowing down, but then nothing more. In fact, it's much more a picture of what the end will be. And God's already given us some clear pictures of what the end will be in our lives if we follow him. We get to spend eternity with him. In fact, I think the dream that Joseph had was much more of an encouragement to hang in there when times get tough, rather than a description of what he had to do. Do you know, there are times when I feel like having some what's-its in church. Maybe we should have some. The dream doesn't give step-by-step instructions for Joseph. It doesn't say, do this, do this, do this, do this, and then your brother will bow down to you. It doesn't say, take these GCSEs and take these A-levels and go to this university and get this job and marry this person and do this and have this number of children and drive this car and whatever. No, it's more of an encouragement. It paints a picture of where he wants him to get to. In fact, the dream was much more about preparation, I think. Did the nasty man take your crisps away? What a horrible man he is. Hello there. Are they nice crisps? Are they nice? I think so. So the dream was actually much more about preparation, I think, for Joseph. When challenges came his way, when the fog of life descended, he could look forward to what God was going to do. And there were several events, weren't there, in Joseph's life, the things we remember from children's stories. His brothers throwing him in a pit, being sold to Egyptian slavers, service in Potiphar's household, temptation by Potiphar's wife, prison, encounters with bakers and cupbearers. They were all things that were going to deter Joseph. But because of the dream of the future he'd had, he could hold on to the plan that God had for him. But I've just given you a list of fog things that happened in Joseph's life, which leads us to the second, hello there, the second sort of theological point for the morning is, I don't believe God sent those things to Joseph. God didn't make his brothers throw him in a pit or sell him to the Egyptian slavers. God doesn't make bad things happen in our lives. He didn't go, I know what Joseph needs today. He needs a nice dose of prison. He doesn't engineer pain in our lives. When you're sitting there thinking through some difficult situations going on in your life now, don't fall into the trap of going, God, what have I done wrong? That's more of the devil than of God. God doesn't send fog to test us and try us. When bad stuff happens in our lives, don't automatically blame yourself or blame God. God loves us and wants the best for us. But he does use the bad stuff to mold us, to train us, to shape us. When the trials come, and they will, don't lean away from God and blame him. Lean into him with tears and with anger if necessary. Lean into him and ask him to teach you through it. Pray the powerful prayer of God, train me and mold me and shape me in this. And I know that's easy to say from the front of church when life's good, and you're probably sitting there thinking, yeah, but Matt, you don't know my life. And I know it's so much harder when you've lost a job or a relationship, or there's sickness or there's death or there's breakdown. But those are the times where we need to lean into him. And dare I say, even lean into the church. For brothers and sisters who will help share the load. There's an oft-quoted verse, isn't there, from Romans. We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. It doesn't mean only good things will happen to us. It doesn't mean that God sends bad things. It means that God will use every experience for his glory if we let him. And that preparation, that moulding, that training can be tough. It can be far-reaching. There's a verse in the Psalms that says this about Joseph's life. He sent a man before them, Joseph, sold as a slave, bruised his feet with shackles, and his neck was put in irons, till what he foretold came to pass. Now, just in the last sort of 10 minutes or so, I just want to look quickly at 3 things that happened in Joseph's life. Because during the fog, during the moulding, during the preparation, it could be easy to give up. And it can be tempting to try and do it our own way. Or to look at the world and go, how would the world say I should deal with this? So we're going to look quickly at sort of 3 opportunities that came Joseph's way. But they were 3 sort of temptations, actually, for him to try and do it the world's way rather than God's. They're not 3 fogs that descended in his life. No, it's more sort of 3 ways that he was tempted to do it his way rather than God's way. And they're classics in our lives. They're the temptations of money, the temptations of sex, and the temptation of power. And if you're interested in those 3 temptations, there's a great book by Richard Foster, who also wrote Celebration of Discipline, if you know that book. He wrote this book in the mid to late 80s called Money, Sex and Power, and the temptations haven't changed in our world. It's a great read, actually. And if you know anything about the fall of Christian leaders across the world, it's always in one of these 3 areas. The temptation of money, of sex, and of power. And often they intertwine as well. Sex is often used to get money and power. And power is probably the greatest aphrodisiac there is. And of course, when you've got a lot of money, you exercise a lot of power. So starting really quickly, starting where Joseph was first tempted with sex. And of course, if you know the story, that came from Potiphar's wife. There was an allurement, there was a temptation that he faced. And it could have broken him. If he'd followed the world's way, which is, well, the offer comes, take it. If he'd followed that, it would have broken him. And it would have broken his relationship with God. And of course, remember, he was a slave living in a society which was fairly devoid of moral value. He was far away from home. And he was alone with an attractive, assertive woman. That temptation was strong. It was totally unexpected. He didn't think it was going to come. Certainly he didn't think it was going to come from the wife of his master. She took the initiative, and Joseph was caught by surprise. And that often happens with temptation. It comes from a quarter that we weren't expecting. Satan doesn't wait for us to put our armor on. He can come from an unknown quarter. And what does that look like in your life? What does the temptation from an unknown quarter look like in your life? And of course, in Joseph's life, not only was it unexpected, there was daily repetition. Hey, sure, we can all resist temptation if it's only once. But there was a daily repetition. Potiphar's wife spoke to him daily. That makes it much harder to say no. Resistance is easily worn down by persistence. And of course, there was favourable opportunity. There were no other men around in the house. They were alone. She was saying, nobody needs to know. And that works with most sins. Opportunity Nobody needs to know. And of course, there was personal advantage for Joseph. If he'd taken her up on the offer, now he's got a special relationship with the boss's wife. He could get anything he wanted just by whispering into her ear. He could turn this to personal advantage. That was the test that he faced. To try and make it happen the world's way. And of course, we know that Joseph beat the temptation, and he did it first by being loyal to God. Being tempted isn't the same as sin. It becomes sin when we act upon it. And Joseph knew it to be sin. How often do we excuse sin by not even calling it sin? Oh, it's a mistake. It was an accident. Joseph named it for what it was. It was a sin. And first and foremost, it was a sin against God. In fact, he was shocked by sin. Most people would have called it a little fling. A little fling with the boss's wife, a one-night stand. No, he called it sin. Most of us don't even like hearing the word sin. You know, we call it other things, as I said, mistakes. Oh, it's not that bad, really. No, it was sin. And then, of course, we know Joseph actually fled temptation. He left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. He was rewarded for that, but not in the way we expected. He was rewarded by being put in prison. He did the right thing and still ended up in prison. He was captured on the outside, but free on the inside. Because he knew he'd done the right thing before God. And interestingly, Joseph really learned to submit to God whilst he was in prison. But don't think you've got it under control. Temptation can strike us when we least expect it. And it's not just a male thing. Remember, it was Potiphar's wife with the issue as well. And of course, there came a second sort of temptation to beat this by doing it the world's way. First was sex, the second is money. At 17, he had the coat of many colours, a symbol of his father's favour. And we all know this if we're parents of teenagers. He could have run to his dad and said, "Dad, lend us a tenner." And his dad would have and not expected it back. He had access to all his dad's money at that age. And he thought his money made him better than those around him. And later, as we move through the story, Genesis 41, he actually got that coat back. He got that coat and more. He had robes of fine linen and gold chains round his neck. He had a signet ring on his finger, which was like a credit card in those days. You could walk up to any market stall and flash your signet ring, and they knew you were good for the money, so you could just take whatever was there. It's like the new BMW or the new whatever in the road. And Joseph could have fallen for the temptation of money. And how many of us, in our daydreaming times, think about winning the lottery because we think all our problems will be solved if that 100 million landed in our laps. But the truth is, and you know this as well as me, the truth is we're already some of the wealthiest people on the planet. You might not feel it, but we are. Do you know what it takes to be in the top 10% wealthiest people on the planet? Do you know what it takes? If you've got a house that you live in, not that you own, but that you live in, that you've got access to a bank account, it may have no money in it, but you've got access to a bank account, that you've got a change pot that you throw a few coppers in, and if you've got 4 days' worth of food in your cupboard or freezer, you're in the top 10% wealthiest people on the planet. And if you want to move up to the top 5%, you only need about £10,000 a year income. And if you want to be in the top 0.1%, you need a family annual income of about £45,000. If you've got that, you're in the top 0.1% on the planet. We're already wealthy, yet we've still got issues and problems. Half the world's population, over 3 billion people, live on less than $2 a day. 95% of the world's population earn less than $10 a day. We're already incredibly wealthy. And this isn't a sermon about giving the church your money. That's not what this is. It's about the recognition that money and wealth can be a temptation to solve our problems and to solve them the world's way. The recognition that actually it can be a really subtle way of knocking us off God's dream for our lives. Imagine if Joseph had held that dream of making people bow down to him and used money to get there. Imagine what that would have looked like. It's really easy to compromise our values, our standards, and our faith by using money and wealth, which is why Jesus said, you can't serve both God and money. And Joseph faced the huge temptation that money and wealth can bring. As a teenager, he had loads. Then he was sold into slavery and he had nothing. Then he moved to Potiphar's household where he had access to loads. Then he was in prison where he had nothing. And then, of course, he moved to Pharaoh's palace where he had millions. He could have just slacked off at that point and lived off the status and wealth he had. But actually, the fate of his family and the nation of Egypt rested in him making the right choices. Don't fall into the temptation of using money to shortcut your way to God's blessing. And of course, thirdly, he faced the temptation of power, didn't he? The signet ring didn't just mark him out as wealthy, it marked him out as somebody with power and authority. And we all know that temptation, to abuse our power and authority. 3 moments in Joseph's life he had power. Age 17, he had power over his brothers. He didn't pass that test very well. Then he was taken as a slave into the household of Potiphar. But he became captain of the guard, quite an important man. Made himself indispensable. And it was only the temptation with Potiphar's wife that upset that apple cart. But he learnt from that. And then, of course, finally, he ended up second in command to the Pharaoh. The most powerful nation on the earth at that point. He was second in command to the most powerful nation in the world. Imagine the power that that would bring. All of the world would submit to him. He had the world in the palm of his hand. Interestingly, he worked for 3 earthly bosses, didn't he? Potiphar, the prison guard, and then Pharaoh. None of them worshipped God. But Joseph still served them diligently, faithfully honouring God and honouring men, which is true for us. We don't hear many sermons about work and how to honour God in our work, but just a couple of things. Maybe Joseph teaches us to honour our boss, even if we don't like them. Honour your boss. Maybe God has put them in that place. Imagine what a world would look like if all the Christians actually worked hard at their job with integrity. Might change our workplaces. And Joseph was also faithful to the gifts that God had given him and the place that God had left him in. He used his gifts and talents wherever he was, whether he was in high office or prison. He used those gifts and talents equally in those places. Sort of remembering that he was gifted for Monday and not just for Sunday. In his working week, he served God the best he could. In administration, in decision making. It was almost tested out in Potiphar's household in order to be useful to the Pharaoh. But it was honed in the prison cell. Working a job that he didn't want to do. Again, don't put your hand up, but many of us will find us in that place. It wasn't a walk in the park. And then he reached the big time. Joseph had more power than any other man on earth beside Pharaoh. It was like a president, a king, a dictator all rolled into one. He had power over Potiphar at that point. How many of us would have abused that power and gone back to Potiphar and said, right? How many of us would have turned to Potiphar's wife and said, right, now I'm in the power position. I'm going to make you pay. But he didn't. Just as I begin to come to a close, there's a great hero of mine called Superman who once said, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I think Lord Acton said it as well, but it sounds better coming from Superman because he had a lot of power. As I conclude, as I hinted at the beginning, apart from those dreams he had when he was 17 and then later when he was sort of 35, we don't read anything else about Joseph's prophetic dream life. Rather, God shifts him from dreamer to leader. The dream was like the goal at the end, and it shifted him from this sort of lazy teenage boy as a dreamer, shifted him over the decades to become the leader that God needed him to be. It wasn't his skill in interpreting dreams that got him out of the fog and saved the nation of Egypt and his family. No, it was his administration and leadership skills that did that. His strategic leadership. It wasn't his dreamer status that kept him in favor with Pharaoh and God for 80 years. It was his desire to serve God first. Of course, we need vision and we need God's given dreams. And maybe those dreams sustained him in the hard times. But he didn't try and force God's hand. He didn't try and use the world's way to get out of the fog. He kept the dream inside and lived it out through his gifts, his skills and experiences. But most of all, he lived it out through his faithfulness. Amen. Thank you.